Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Nikolaevna, the four daughters of Russia's last emperor and empress, continue to fascinate people around the world more than a century after their brutal killings in Ekaterinburg in 1918. Often thought of as a single unit, using a nickname they sometimes used to refer to all four of them, OTMA, seen as beautiful young ladies in white dresses, or as dutiful wartime nurses, or even as naïve young women who had few friends and little contact with the world outside the palace, their lives have been steeped in modern-day mythology. However, with the opening of the Russian state archives following the fall of the Soviet Union, the letters and diaries of the Grand Duchesses are now revealing interesting and fascinating details about their sadly short lives. Nicholas II and Alexandra Fedorovna's oldest child, Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna, was born on 3rd November 1895. While they may have hoped for a boy, they were more than thrilled to be parents and even took baby Olga with them the following year on their visit to England and France. Over the following few years, 3 more daughters were born: Tatiana on 29th of May 1897, Maria on 14th June 1899, and Anastasia on the 5th of June 1901. Olga has been described by a close friend and confidant of the Empress, Anna Zurabova, as being the most like her mother in her nature. She had light-coloured hair and was known for being straightforward and honest. Growing up, she was stubborn, independent, and forthright. She was somewhat hot-tempered and sensitive. Olga was musical, playing piano excellently by ear and having a confident, if thin, singing voice. She loved poetry and reading, and possessed a deep and serious religiosity. In her files at the Russian State Archives are many notebooks filled with where she has copied out favourite poems and religious quotes. Nicholas and Alexandra's second daughter, Tatiana, had a gentle nature. She was somewhat shy and reserved, but conversely was also the Grand Duchess who enjoyed outside company the most. Tatiana was tall, slim, and elegant. She had dark hair and grey eyes. She was very close to her parents and tried hard to always be obedient to their wishes. Tatiana was very skilled at needlework and had good taste and a sense for fashion. She strived to be helpful to others and was a born nurse. Her siblings called her the governess, as she looked out for them, ensuring that they were doing all that their parents and teachers had instructed. Her cousin Irina affectionately called her Tanichka. To her younger sister, she was Tanka. Maria had a very easygoing, kind and friendly nature. She was very beautiful, with thick golden brown hair and large, luminous blue eyes, known in the family as Marie's saucers. She had inherited her grandfather Alexander III's strong build, and as a teenager was able to lift up her English tutor Mr. Gibbs. She loved little children dearly. Maria was stoic and possessed a great deal of inner strength and energy, which stood her in good stead during captivity. She was a great support to her mother during the days of uncertainty of February 1917, while her other sisters were sickening with measles, and was chosen by her parents to accompany them when the family was split up in April 1918. Within the family she was often called Marie, and was affectionately named Masha, Mashka, and even Mandrifali by her brother. The youngest Grand Duchess Anastasia had, as Anna Zurabova had described it, an extremely lively and original personality. She was always finding some form of mischief as a child, and was keenly observant of people's foibles and comical features. Anastasia was a born mimic. As a child, she was sometimes described as an enfant terrible. She was always on the go. One of the guards at Ekaterinburg described her as being like quicksilver. While she never lost her sense of humour and joie de vivre, the seriousness of the situation she and her family found themselves in had its impact, and Anastasia's later letters show a much more sober and serious side to her nature. Anastasia's childhood nicknames were Nastaska and Malinkaya, and then during the war she started calling herself Schwibzik, which was also the name of her Pomeranian dog. The meaning of the name is uncertain. It could be from an old, somewhat obscure Russian word shibzik, meaning a short person, or perhaps from a Germanic term for a tipsy, merry person. Empress Alexandra was a very involved mother, as her own mother had been, breastfeeding her daughters, as well as using a wet nurse, and nursing them through childhood illnesses. In 1901, Olga became ill with typhoid. The Empress wrote to Margareta von Fabris, "Please do not expect any letters from me now, as Olga has come down with typhoid. Luckily, it is a mild form. I am with her as much as possible. She is in a single room, dozes much, drinks only a little milk. Rather bad-tempered today, as her sisters are of course strictly kept from her." Later on, Alexandra also nursed Anastasia through diphtheria. The Empress paid close attention to her daughter's education. The Grand Duchesses had a very full curriculum of study, mostly with private tutors, such as the Russian language tutor Pyotr Petrov and the French tutor Pierre Gilliard, but they also attended physics classes in a classroom at the Realnoy school. Lessons began at 9 and continued until 1 when there was a break for lunch. After lunch there was time for walks in the park and other activities before lessons resumed at 5 and continued until 7 or 8 in the evening, though on Saturdays lessons finished at lunchtime. In 1909, the imperial family paid a visit to the Isle of Wight. Maria recounted in her English exercise book how they met Auntie May and Cousin Mary, who was the Princess of Wales, later Queen Mary, and her daughter, and had played on the seashore looking for seashells. Olga and Tatiana went into town to go shopping and bought their younger sister's bracelets. The following year, owing to her failing health, doctors ordered the Empress to undergo treatment at Bad Nauheim in Germany. The doctors were also concerned over Tatiana's heart, and she was also prescribed treatment at the baths. The imperial family stayed at Friedberg Castle, which belonged to the Empress's brother, Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse. Every morning after breakfast, the Grand Duchesses would go for a walk with their governess, Sophia Turcheva, especially enjoying going to shops and buying a variety of items. Anastasia, in particular, was delighted with the toy shops, where all kinds of things for dolls could be bought. In the afternoons, they enjoyed excursions in motor cars to various places of interest in the surrounding countryside. After the treatments at Bad Nauheim were finished, the family moved to Wolfsgarten before returning to Russia. In 1911, the family travelled to Kiev for the unveiling of a monument to Emperor Alexander II. While there, the Emperor attended the opera with Olga and Tatiana. During the last intermission of the show, while the Emperor had left the royal box to have some tea, Prime Minister Stolypin was shot. Sophia Turcheva, who was also present, reported the confusion in the immediate aftermath, recalling that Olga thought perhaps one of the boxes had collapsed, and Tatiana asking why the Prime Minister was covered in blood. Olga recorded in her diary that evening how Stolypin was taken to a clinic and the crowd at the theatre stood and sang the national anthem. Every summer before World War I, the family would spend time at Peterhof on the Gulf of Finland and go for a cruise on the imperial yacht Standard around the Finnish skerries. The Standard held a special place in the hearts of the Grand Duchesses, and they always refer to it as the Dear Standard in their letters and diaries. On their cruises, they would stop off at various islands and skerries, where there would be picnics, games, swimming in the sea, and walks. When younger, Alexandra Fyodorovna would join in on the walks and activities. But as her health deteriorated, she more and more often stayed on board ship, while her daughters took turns to stay with her. Olga writing to her grandmother about how sad it was that her mother was unable to join in with them. On board the ship, the Grand Duchesses would go roller skating and play card games, dice games, and puzzles in the evening. There was also the cinematograph, which they all looked forward to. All four Grand Duchesses loved summer and lying around in the sun. Olga wrote to her Russian tutor Pyotr Petrov in 1913, "It was 34 degrees in the sun. Well, isn't the weather tempting? We are all very tanned, which I am very happy about, and we are all healthy." This fondness for an outdoors life, lying in the sun and getting tanned, caused some controversy on the 1914 summer visit to Constanța, Romania, where the Grand Duchess's tanned skin was unfavourably commented upon by ladies at the Romanian court. The Grand Duchesses enjoyed a great rapport with the officers on board. In 1911, Tatiana wrote to her grandmother about Olga's name day on board ship. "In the morning, the officers gave me a packet and asked me to give it to Olga, so I did. And what do you think was in it? A frame made out of card and a portrait of David they got out of the newspaper. Olga laughed a lot and for a long time about it." The picture was of the heir to the British throne, who was at the time speculated to be a future match for one of the older Grand Duchesses by the press. After the summer cruise, the family would return to Livadia in the Crimea, where they also spent time in spring around Easter, when the Grand Duchesses would assist their parents in handing out eggs and Easter bread or kulich to people. Grand Duchess Olga said that in Petersburg they worked, but in Livadia they lived, and this was certainly the case. There were excursions, visits to friends and relatives, shopping expeditions in Yalta, whereas Olga wrote, "It's fun to drive along the embankment and meet acquaintances," and dances. In the mornings, the Grand Duchesses would go swimming in the sea with the Tsar, and in the afternoons there were tennis matches. In September 1913, Grand Duchess Tatiana wrote to her grandmother, "We go swimming in the sea every morning, which is dreadfully fun, especially when there are waves. I know how to swim now, so it's awfully enjoyable. After lunch, we usually play tennis, and there is a little house and garden there where we have tea." Livadia was also the place where the Grand Duchesses took part in the White Flower Day, a charity for tuberculosis patients, and also in the bazaars, where they would diligently make a range of things for sale. All four Grand Duchesses were honorary regimental chiefs and took a great interest in their regiments. In 1912 and 1913, both Olga and Tatiana took part in the manoeuvres at Krasное Selo in late summer. Tatiana recorded in her 1913 diary, "In the morning at 10:30, Olga and I went by motor to the regimental parade in full dress uniform. We were on horseback there. Uncle Nicolasha met us. I stayed by the side of the road where there was a crowd of people in the suite. Olga went with Uncle to her regiment. Afterwards, when they came back, we went to the front of my regiment. I greeted each escadron separately, then went back and stood on the right flank of my regiment in front of the commander. Olga stood with her regiment. After that, Papa arrived here and began to inspect my regiment. I followed him to Olga's regiment, and she went around with him, and I followed behind. After that, Papa went to the tent and stayed there. Olga, Uncle, and I went on farther. When my regiment started its ceremonial marches, I rode ahead of the regimental commander, behind General Oranovsky, who commanded our brigade, stood until the whole regiment had passed by. Olga did the same in front of her regiment." In spring 1913, the imperial family set out on a journey, visiting various places associated with the history of the Romanov dynasty, as part of the tercentenary celebrations of Romanov rule, culminating in the imperial family visiting Moscow. Olga described the journey in a letter to her grandmother. "The trip was so awfully interesting. We saw so much that my head is all in a whirl. All those wonderful old churches. At Nizhny Novgorod and Kostroma there were tea parties with the nobility, terribly stuffy of course, but not too dreadful. At Yaroslavl there was a big party and concert. Sabinov, the Zbruyev Quartet, Chuprinikov and Plevitskaya sang. There was a big ball in Moscow, which was very beautifully put together and had 2,000 attendees. Papa, Tatiana and I left before the supper. Aunt Olga with us, but the rest stayed on until the end. Mama was there too." By 1913, prospective husbands for the older Grand Duchesses were being talked about. As mentioned earlier, the Prince of Wales was one whose name came up, but also Prince Alexander of Serbia and Prince Carol of Romania's names were also brought up as potential prospective partners in newspapers. In March 1914, Empress Alexandra's cousin, Queen Marie of Romania, accompanied by her husband Nando and son Prince Karol, visited the Romanovs at Tsarskoye Selo, and probably talks began about potentially matching Grand Duchess Olga with Karol, to whom Tatiana appears to have taken a shine, affectionately referring to him as Karlusha in her diary. The Romanovs paid a one-day reciprocal visit on June the 1st the same year, setting sail from Yalta the night before. It was to be in vain, Olga already having made up her mind that she would not marry Prince Karol, telling her French tutor Pierre Gilliard that she was Russian and intended to stay Russian, and that her father would not force her into a marriage that she herself did not want. The idea of a Romanian-Romanov marriage was not completely lost, however, as on a visit to Tsarskoye Selo in January 1917, Prince Karol also asked the Tsar about the possibility of his marrying Grand Duchess Maria, to which the Tsar responded that Maria was still a schoolgirl, and such a marriage was out of the question. Following the return from Romania, the summer continued as usual for the Grand Duchesses. There was a cruise in the Gulf of Finland and a visit from their cousin George Battenberg with the British squadron. The Grand Duchesses enjoyed being shown over the ships and meeting the British naval officers. Tatiana described it in her diary. "We were assigned 4 young men, what they call midshipmen in their language, and what we call the ship's Garda Marines. They showed we 4 and Aunt Olga about and explained everything. They were very nice. Then we had luncheon with Admiral Beatty. The commanders of the other ships and his wife were there. After luncheon, everyone took photos. Then we went on their boat past the Queen Mary and the Princess Royal to the New Zealand, which is Georgie's ship. From there, back on the Alexandria and to Peterhof." Following this was an official visit by President Poincaré of France in early July. Then, rather than a continuation of cruising on the Standard, war. On 19th of July 1914, Grand Duchess Olga recorded in her diary, "After the all-night vigil, we learnt that those pigs, the Germans, had declared war on us. Help us, O Lord." And Tatiana recorded that the dragoons and Finnish regiments had already set off for the war. In early August, the imperial family headed to Moscow, where there were church services at the Kremlin and inspections of military trains and hospitals. After Moscow, the family visited the Trinity Lavra before heading back to Tsarskoye Selo, where the Empress along with Olga and Tatiana began training as Red Cross nurses. They were helping in the hospitals as early as August, when Tatiana wrote to her friend Olga Voronova, "Mama, Olga and I go every day to the Palace Hospital, where we bandage the wounded. We both have 3 people each whom we must bandage." Before long, they were assisting at more serious operations. On September 3rd, Tatiana wrote to Grand Duchess Ksenia that they had assisted at the amputation of an index finger, saying, "It was not particularly appetizing, but we got through it safely." As time went on, Tatiana became a skillful nurse. At first, Olga and Tatiana looked after wounded soldiers, while the Empress and Anna Vyrubova looked after the wounded officers, but soon Olga and Tatiana also began nursing officers too. Tatiana took a special shine to one of the wounded officers, Dmitry Malama, who gave her a French bulldog in September 1914, which she named Ortipo. Tatiana doted on Ortipo, who slept on her bed, disturbing Olga in the same room with his snoring. The days soon took on a regular routine of visits to the Znamenia church, nursing, playing games with the recovering wounded officers, lessons, and then back to spend time with the officers in the evening. Maria and Anastasia, while too young to train as nurses, also spent a lot of their time visiting the wounded, cheering them up and playing games with them. Olga and Tatiana also established committees, Olga accepting donations to help the families of the called-up reserves, and Tatiana for helping refugees. At the infirmary, aside from nursing duties, the Grand Duchesses spent endless hours with the wounded, bringing them puzzles, teaching them to knit, and keeping them entertained so it was not so boring to be lying in bed, as Tatiana wrote to Olga Voronova. On New Year's 1915, the imperial family's great friend Anna Vyrubova was severely injured in a train wreck to the point where her life was feared of, and Olga and Tatiana would visit her in the hospital every day after doing their dressings. Empress Alexandra had worn herself out towards the end of 1914, and Olga was taking on a bigger role in the family, taking on messages and requests and relaying them back to her father. Her responsibilities continued to grow through these war years, but they also took their toll on her, as by the end of the year of 1915, she too was suffering from illness and exhaustion and was prescribed arsenic injections to help restore her health. Olga was not happy to have to take time out, writing to Grand Duchess Ksenia in early November 1915 that I too, to my embarrassment, have gone off somehow for 5 days now and have been lying down and not able to go to the infirmary, which is awfully upsetting as I'm so used to seeing everyone. In May 1915, Anastasia was devastated when her little Pomeranian dog, Schwibzik, died from a brain inflammation. While she herself may have been called Schwibzik before this, it was from this time onwards that Anastasia began using the name as a nickname for herself in her letters to her father, who was often absent at the front and visiting army units. Later that year, he would take over supreme command of the Russian army. In October 1915, the family visited the Emperor and Alexei at his military headquarters for 4 days, after having visited hospitals in Tver, Ryazan, Veliky Luki and Orsha. They eagerly received letters from the nurses at the infirmaries at Tsarskoye, keeping up to date with their patients at home, while enjoying seeing their father and brother and hearing about the goings-on at the front from officers. In April 1916, the Empress and the Grand Duchesses visited the English hospital in Petrograd. One of the nurses there, Canadian Dorothy Cotton, described the visit. We had a visit from the Empress and 4 of the girls, Olga, Tatiana, one 15 and one with her hair down her back. She looked about 13, supposed to be the beauty of the family. The 2 oldest were dressed alike in grey, so simply but awfully smart. They are dears and went about so nicely and talked to everyone. They gave each patient a little icon to wear around his neck, and in most cases put it on them themselves. In May, the Empress and her daughters travelled to Mogilev for the Emperor's birthday, and then the whole family travelled on to Crimea. It was to be their last visit as a family there. There were church services and visits to the sanatoriums and infirmaries. At Sevastopol, the family inspected the dreadnoughts Empress Catherine and the Empress Maria. Tatiana wrote about going on the Empress Catherine. We walked around the deck and then went to the lower one, into the casemates, descended into the turbines, climbed the tower where they showed us how to load a gun. It was terribly interesting. The visit culminated with a day at Evpatoria. Maria recorded in her diary, "We went to Anya's dacha. Rita was there, had tea and ran about barefoot in the water. Had a walk at Sarabuz station, and Anya went back to her dacha." The family parted ways at Kursk, with the Tsar and Alexei returning to Mogilev, and the Empress and the Grand Duchesses back to Petrograd. Through the year, there were several more trips to Mogilev to spend time with the Tsar and Alexei. The Grand Duchesses thoroughly enjoyed the break from routine, despite missing the wounded whom they cared for. Near the Tsar's headquarters was a refugee camp for families who'd had to escape from the fighting at the front, and in summer 1916 they became playmates of the Grand Duchesses and would wait for them in the mornings to come out of the train carriages. Grand Duchess Maria's 1916 diary makes frequent reference to playing with these children in August and September, with such comments such as, "We tossed the children into the pit with Lavrov and Yergashov." There's even a photograph in the imperial family's photo albums showing the children standing in a big pit posing for a photograph. Tatiana took the time to label the names of the children in her photo albums. On 17 December 1916, Maria recorded in her diary about the disappearance of Grigory Rasputin. "Bad news. Grigory disappeared since last night. No one knows where he is." The following day she recorded that there was still no news, but that Felix Yusupov and Dmitri were suspected of having something to do with his disappearance. On the 19th, they finally knew that he had been killed, and the family went to meet Nicholas and Alexei, who returned from Stavka. The Emperor, Empress, and all 4 Grand Duchesses attended his burial service on the 21st of December. The Empress placed an icon she'd received in Novgorod in the coffin, which the whole imperial family signed. In January 1917, Anastasia received a new pet, which was to become her constant companion for the rest of her life. She wrote to her Russian tutor Pyotr Petrov about it. "Have you heard the news that I have a dog? It's called Baby, a stupid nickname given to it by its previous owners. It's a Japanese breed. He is small and black. He'll be 2 years old on the 18th. Anastasia promptly renamed the dog Jimmy, and her letters from then on were full of references to "my Jim." In February 1917, measles struck the imperial household. A friend who had been playing with Alexei passed it on, and before long, Alexei, Olga, Tatiana, and Anya Virubova were all sick. On the 25th of February, Anastasia wrote to her father, "It will be interesting to know when I will get sick, and who will get it first, Maria or me?" As it happened, Anastasia came down sick before Maria. Not long after this, Maria too succumbed to the measles. All 4 Grand Duchesses were very ill for a long time. Olga ended up with rheumatic fever, and they only began their convalescence well into March, in a world that had drastically changed over the course of their illness, with the abdication of their father and the arrest of the imperial family by the provisional government and restrictions on their movements. For the Grand Duchesses, to not be able to go and visit their beloved wounded in the infirmaries was very hard to bear. Tatiana writing, "It is sad, having now recovered, that we cannot go back to work in the infirmary. So it's strange to be at home in the morning and not doing dressings." As spring arrived, the 4 Grand Duchesses joined in with garden work, planting a vegetable garden. Nicholas would cut down the dead trees in the park, and the Grand Duchesses sometimes assisted in the chopping up of wood and stacking it. As the season turned to summer, the family spent the afternoons outside. Maria wrote to a friend that Alexei runs a lot and douses everyone with water from the pump while we're swinging in the hammock. We usually get drenched, but dry out quickly in the sun. Lessons continued for the younger Grand Duchesses, with members of the suite and Olga acting as teachers, Olga writing to Pyotr Petrov. Studies go on as usual. Maria and I worked together on English. She reads aloud to me, and if it's not too hot, a dictation reading. Twice a week I do Russian history with her. Twice a week I read medieval Russian history with Anastasia, but my memory for these events is no good, but she's no better. Despite becoming a teacher for her younger siblings, Olga continued to study history, art history, and Russian literature. As the political situation in Russia continued to deteriorate, a decision was taken by the provisional government to move the imperial family to Tobolsk in Siberia. After a sleepless night full of delays, the family boarded a train at daybreak on the 1st of August and headed to Siberia. The journey to Tobolsk was completed by riverboat. The family had to stay on board the boat for a number of days after arrival, as the house was not ready for them. Finally, on the 15th of August, they settled into their new accommodation. A month later, Tatiana described their new conditions in a letter to her aunt Ksenia. "We sit in the garden a lot, or in the yard in front of the house, where a piece of the street is fenced off for us. It's awfully pleasant that we have a balcony which is warmed by the sun from morning to evening. It's fun to sit there and watch the street as everyone goes passing by. We walk back and forth so as not to forget how to walk. We've been to church twice. You can imagine what a joy it was for us after 6 months. Over the winter, the Grand Duchesses, along with French tutor Pierre Gilliard, began putting on short plays to pass the time in the evenings. They continued to study, write letters, and eagerly await letters from friends and family, numbering them carefully, and noting that many letters were not getting through in both directions. On Christmas Eve, the family handed out homemade Christmas presents to the remaining staff and celebrated the vigil service at home with a church choir. Later still, the choir was not able to come regularly, and the Empress and Grand Duchesses took the place of the choir. The October Revolution slowly began to have its effect on life in Tobolsk, and some of the staff had to be let go as they could no longer be afforded. The Grand Duchess's letters continued to stay cheerful, describing their daily routine and recalling shared memories with their friends from happier times. Maria is recorded as having said that she'd be happy to stay on for good in Tobolsk, but it was not to be. In April 1918, Commissar Yakovlev arrived in Tobolsk with a directive to move the imperial family. Unfortunately, Alexei, having had a bad cold, had been coughing so badly he'd caused an internal hemorrhage and was unable to be moved. Empress Alexandra was in despair at having to choose whether to stay in Tobolsk with her suffering son or to accompany her husband to wherever the Commissar would take him. In the end, she chose to go with Nicholas, leaving Alexei in the care of Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. Maria accompanied her parents. In Valentin Speransky's book The House of Special Purpose, one of the people he interviewed had this to say about why Maria accompanied her parents. First of all, I would like to convey to you the remarkable judgment of one of my friends on the Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna. It is not for nothing that her parents chose their third daughter, at the most tragic moment, to accompany them to Golgotha. Maria, despite her 19 years, possessed a full and stoic character, and knew by her inexhaustible energy how to encourage all those who were depressed. The family expected that the Emperor, Empress and Maria were to be taken to Moscow. However, en route, the Ural Soviet demanded the train carrying the prisoners be sent on to Ekaterinburg, where they were housed in a house belonging to the merchant Ipatiev, which had now been renamed the House of Special Purpose. As soon as Alexei was well enough to be moved, he and his sisters boarded the Rus, the steamer that had brought them to Tobolsk, and headed off to join their parents and sister in Ekaterinburg, where the family were joyfully reunited. Here the family spent 2.5 months with little to no news from the outside, in a house with whitewashed, closed windows. For days the family had heard the sound of the White Army approaching Ekaterinburg, and had been receiving letters written in French promising to help them. These were a ruse by the Bolsheviks. And the Romanovs, realizing that something was not quite right with the letters, had cut off communication with the writer. So maybe it did not come as a big surprise when they were awoken in the early hours and told that they were needed to be moved for their own safety. After having washed and dressed, the family came down through the house, out into the courtyard, and then descended the 23 steps down into the cellar and martyrdom.
Order now your copy of the Romanov Royal Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal, which is an impressive 512-page book, featuring nearly 200 black and white photographs, and a 56-page photo insert, of more than 80 high-quality colorized images, appearing here in print for the first time.